Hey, Eric, this is Brett Federley. How are you?
We ready to rock?
He's just running a hair behind.
Eric. Hello.
Good afternoon.
Good to see you. Sorry about votes.
Well, that's the nature of being in the Senate. You actually have to take a vote from time to time.
Time to time, but it'd be nice if Schumer could give us some theory of when those times might occur.
Well, Mr. Senator, we're being projected around, so but we're delighted to have you with us. And let me do a very quick introduction, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your patience. The senator was on the floor taking votes, and as I say, that is the nature of the beast. And we are delighted, in fact, that Senator Ben Sasse has been willing to join us even during a very busy time on the Senate schedule. What a pleasure, Mr. Senator, to have the opportunity to welcome you back to the Washington Conference on the Americas. You are, to this day, and I say this with personal and direct knowledge, one of the most compelling and electric speakers we've ever featured at this conference. And so we're delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you back. Ladies and gentlemen, the senator is very well known, and we've hosted him before. His bio is on our website, along with all the other bios of our speakers today. And so although you deserve much better, I'm just going to jump in if you're okay with that.
I prefer it.
All right, fantastic. Well, let's get going. Senator, before we get to the topic of the day, which is trade and Latin America and this sort of thing, one of the things that has made the United States given a leadership position in the Western Hemisphere has been the power of example, the power of our own democracy. And yet when we talk to folks around the hemisphere, they suggest that maybe our own democracy is a little bit tarnished, and therefore we have to be a little bit humble when we try to promote democracy abroad. And I'm wondering, you've spoken eloquently about these issues. I wonder if you could just give us a sense from your perspective in the Senate, what's the state of American democracy today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you to you, Eric, and for everyone else for giving me a little bit of time. I mean, I think as a historian, probably more than as a policymaker, when we come to this question, 100 years from now, when people look back at our moment, what are they going to think was unique about our moment? The vast majority of time, if history is change over time, changes your numerator and your denominator, your x-axis is time. What really changes at any given moment? And usually there's lots more continuity than discontinuity. People always think there's discontinuity. We always think we live at the inflection point of human history, but usually not much change from 50 or 20 years ago till 20 years from now or 50 years from now. I don't think that's true in our moment. I think 100 years from now or beyond, when people look back in our moment, they're not really going to talk about our politics. They're going to talk about the fact that we are living through a digital revolution, which is unsettling all of economics and therefore basically all of culture. Human identity markers are highly, highly correlated to work. What do you do every day with your time that provides for you and your family and, puts bread on the table, but also serves your neighbor? And your work identity is tied to place. And what's happening in the digital revolution is that both of those things are being radically transformed and unsettled. And so there has never been a civilization of lifelong learners before. Aspirationally, I wish there were. There are always people who are still reading books at 60 or at 80. But by and large, most people have a pretty settled view of the world and definitely of what kind of work they're going to do by sometime during adolescence. And it has never been the case in the, nomadic period from eternity past until 10,000 BC, 10,000 years ago, or from the agrarian revolution of 10,000 years ago until the industrial revolution of 150 to 200 years ago, and then that third epic, the era from industrialization and the market revolution up until sometime quarter century ago. There's never been doubt that you'd have lifelong work. Nomads and agrarians didn't even have a conversation about what work they would do. They just did what mom and dad, grandma and grandpa did. The market revolution and capitalism and industrialization create economic specialization, which is great for productivity in the world. And people end up overproducing. And that's where most trade comes from, is the comparative advantage of the way people produce. And there was a lot of identity crisis around industrialization, mass immigration, urbanization in the US in particular. 1870 to 1890 were a terribly unsettled period. And then things get a lot calmer by the 19 teens and 20s as people figure out what social capital in cities looks like. But that was one time that you had an identity crisis. You went through adolescence, you figured out what work you were going to do, and then you did it till death or retirement. I think the most fundamental thing that's happening in our time is we're seeing the end of lifelong work, and that unsettles identity, it unsettles community, and it necessarily unsettles politics. And so I think, I don't usually use the word democracy proper because I think pure democracy is a very dangerous and bad thing. It moves way, way too fast. And so democratic republicanism is really what we mean. And in America right now, there is a lot of self-doubt that doesn't flow primarily from our politics, but it flows from the fact that people's identities are unsettled, their communities are unsettled, and therefore their sense of trust in institutions is unsettled. And that's some of why, I'll pull up here, but that's some of why trade is on the outs, why it's unpopular, because it becomes a scapegoat where what's really happening in Youngstown, Ohio, is automation and digitization are making us so much more productive that lots of big tool economy jobs become less marginally useful at the labor level because automation and software have figured out so much of that. And people want to project that on globalization. Some pieces of the equation are globalization, but a minority piece. And trade suffers in the public's view because it's easier to demagogue something that comes from afar than admitting that really smart human brains, which all of us have figured out how to automate repetitive tasks.
So when I was going to school, and I'll date myself by saying in the 1980s primarily, it was thought that trade was a part of the strategic arsenal of the United States, important not just for our own domestic well-being, but frankly for our position abroad. But what you just described is a situation that's throwing everything out of whack. Is that still true? Is trade still a strategic importance to the United States? And if so, how do we get back the vision that, in fact, we need to pursue it?
Yeah. So first of all, absolutely. But if you almost think of it as like nested cores of what people believe in and where they find their identity, what are their stories, what teams are they a part of, who is the we, and who is the sometimes dangerous other they, people's view of mortality and purpose is going to trump how they think about politics. And then once they start thinking about politics, they're usually going to think domestic first, unless you're at war or on the edge of war. We actually are. Xi Jinping plans to invade Taiwan. The public dates, not crossing a classified line here, are that he would view sliding beyond 2027 as a failure. He is absolutely plotting his, unjust invasion of Taiwan, and that has massive implications for us. So in a certain sense, we are at the very edge of geopolitical danger, the near edge, I mean, and yet the public doesn't feel it that way. So to your proper point, yes, economic engagement and commerce is a really important way to identify who your allies are and to figure out who you also want to have shared politics with, who you want to have shared military alliances with, who you're going to share intelligence with. I've spent a lot of the last month in Asia, met with a lot of key U.S. allies, heads of state, foreign ministers, defense ministers, and intel chiefs. And when you're there, a very common message is obviously the defining geopolitical equation of the next decade is the long-term technology race between the US and the CCP. We, country X, would strongly prefer to be a US ally than be on the CCP side of this equation. But China's here with a lot more economic engagement than you are, and it's going to be almost impossible for us to have a military and a diplomatic and an intel sharing alliance with the United States if China is everybody's number one trading partner and you guys are acting like you're withdrawing from the world. So absolutely, trade is a key part of our security architecture and arsenal. It's mutually beneficial. Comparative advantage leads to positive sums. It's not a zero-sum game, but it also is a really important diplomatic, political, military leavening. It's a common cause that happens next to the economics. And right now, we're not doing a good job of telling that story either abroad or at home.
What you've just described is also a perfect description of what we're hearing across much of Latin America, frankly, and the Caribbean. But there could be some opportunity. No, I mean, coming out of COVID, people are talking about shifting supply chains primarily out of China, primarily to near sourcing or friend shoring. That I guess is the term du jour. But also Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine has scrambled energy and agriculture markets, two areas where Latin America, particularly South America, is really, quite vibrant and competitive. And I wonder, coming from an agriculture state, Nebraska, you've written eloquently, by the way, in at least one of your books about, your kids and, being in an agriculture setting, terrific life stories there. But the question would be, how can we use this as an opportunity from the trade perspective to build that relationship with the Western Hemisphere, particularly as we're heading to a Summit of the Americas in just a month from today?
Yeah, so I don't want to put too partisan a point on this, but I guess maybe a way to be bipartisan about it is that Bob Menendez and I and a few others sent a letter just end of last week, early this week, to Catherine Tai, the U.S. trade rep, and said, where's the beef? I mean, the beef's in Nebraska. We're the largest cattle state in the union. Let me go full homer for a minute. Some people might wrongly believe it's Texas. They have more head. We have more pounds. We have more cattle on feed. We have more dollar produced, and we have more exports. But anyway, what I mean by where's the beef is, what's the agenda for the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep? There are a whole bunch of very competent, smart negotiators who leave much better compensated private sector jobs because they want to negotiate. They know that trade is beneficial. They know that it's a win-win. They know that it's not only an economic win-win, but it sets up exactly as you said a minute ago, Eric, a lot of the military alliance conversations. And right now, in 17 months of the Biden administration, it appears that the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep could have been, on morphine asleep for a year and a half straight, and there'd be no differential output between what they've done and if they'd been in a coma. And so right now we need the administration to lead, and there are voices in the Congress. I mean, it feels like we're a minority in both of our parties. Pat Toomey and I are probably the most pro-free trade Republicans. And sometimes it feels like we're running against headwinds in our party. Obviously, the Democrats have a bunch of labor union problems and many sort of environmental issues that are sometimes genuine and sometimes masks for underlying labor protectionism. But I believe that we should be doing some of that. Your term friend shoring is a really good one. We should be recognizing that it is a dangerous thing to depend on someone that you cannot depend on. And American companies should recognize that the dependencies they have on the CCP, nominally private sector companies, often in China, but, with all sorts of national security laws that make it clear who their alliances, who their responsibilities are to, and where they share their data and who they get their marching orders from. It is a very dangerous thing for U.S. supply chains to run as clearly through CCP control as they do right now. And that's pre-COVID. COVID has exacerbated all that. So we should have this as an opportunity to build new alliances and new relationships. And obviously, transport costs are a part of the economic calculus. And so if you can supply and source some of this stuff closer to home, transport costs are down. We ought to be pursuing exactly the agenda you're talking about. And I hope we hear a little more of that from the administration next month. I'm not too optimistic about it today.
Yeah, it's certainly an area of opportunity for sure, and something the council has been pushing for over 60 years of our existence, but certainly recently as well. But something you hit on, I think, is really important as well. You know, it used to be in U.S. politics that there was at least one party that more or less stood up for free trade. After World War II, it was generally the Democrats, and then in recent years, it was generally the Republicans. But in recent years, just as you alluded to, Senator, we've seen the sides of both parties come around and almost reinforce each other for different reasons, perhaps, but not supporting trade. And so the question is, who's standing up for trade? And I wonder, as we only have a couple minutes left, and I'm very mindful of your time, but how can we break through that political logjam and get back to a place where at least agriculture states see this as an exporting opportunity, and my home state of Washington is an export opportunity for high tech and all the things and services. I mean, it seems like we've lost the thread in the conversation. If you have any words of wisdom, frankly, to help us get back to that place, we really appreciate hearing them.
Yeah, so I am not being pessimistic here, but I don't want to be Pollyannish either. I think we need to be realistic about the fact that there are two big domestic problems we're going to need to solve before there's a broad American consensus about the benefits of trade again. I'm not in doubt about the benefits of trade, but I'm well aware that our public is. And so I think two things. One is about our social media environment, and the second is about the nature of lifelong work. So first of all, the most overrepresented people, maybe this goes back to where you started, Eric, with some of the challenges in the workings of our governance structures. The most overrepresented people in America by miles are the very online, very angry, loud people. Right. So just to give you a couple of Twitter stats, because the journalistic environment, and I know we're open press here, often treats what happens on Twitter as if it's reality, and it's not. It's an institutionalizable ward. So 19% of Americans are on Twitter. Jack Dorsey told me that 60% of that 19% never read a thing about politics when they're on Twitter. So now you're at 40% of 19%. So for those of you doing math at home, we're at less than 8% of the public is getting any politics from Twitter. 85% of tweets come from less than 3% of tweeters. So now we're at way under 1%. Come up with another issue in life where you would say really angry people who pull comments out of context and reduce it to sort of Manichaean good versus evil on every topic, and they're less than 1%. We ought to give them the floor. Imagine doing that at a football stadium. The sort of angriest guy in the corner snuck in with a fifth of some hard liquor, 80 proof something, and he's screaming at the refs, and the refs go, well, actually, we should probably change that call. He did catch the ball. It's an interception, right? Like nowhere in life do we do that. And yet journalism right now acts like what happens on Twitter is representative of the public. So first of all, we're going to need habits for a ubiquitous data and communications environment. And right now we don't have that. The printing press transformed the nature of information transmission in the written word. The internet is going to transform a lot of stuff. And on net, I believe most of it will be for the good, but we got to figure out habits for it. But this relates to the point we started with about the disruption of long-term work. People want to be able to scapegoat something, and believing that trade is the reason why, a factory job, and I picked Youngstown randomly earlier, pays a lot less compared to the median American wage today. It was a great job in 1958. It's a much harder job today. And there are all sorts of reasons why, but it's not fundamentally about trade. It's fundamentally about automation. And in a deliberative democracy, we need a broader sense of the public to get that. So I want to advocate for trade, but I think we should recognize that the TPP's collapse is the single best example of sort of social media becoming a narrative that moved a lot of the public, and politicians decided to cower to it. Both parties in 2015 were pro-TPP. By the time Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were nominated for the Republican and Democratic nominees in the summer of 2016, both parties had turned against TPP because people put their finger in the wind and they said, well, the public says trade's bad, well, therefore we ought to do it. Well, actually, Chairman Xi is the happiest of all people on earth, the world's biggest, baddest dictator, as horrible as Vladimir Putin is and his unjust, illegal invasion. Xi Jinping is the guy that can change the world order for the really long term. There's no person on earth happier about the US abandonment of TPP than Chairman Xi. And so we needed leaders that would actually tell the people the truth, even if it might be short-term unpopular. You lose an election, tough crap. Go home and do another calling. Like it's fine. Like George Washington and the Society of Cincinnatus were named for the idea that you didn't think staying in Washington was your main purpose. And right now we have too many politicians rushing to get in front of the mob saying, I must go. There's a mob here and I am their leader. You're not their leader. You're a coward. And so we ought to have more people that actually try to explain trade and the geopolitical realities to our people. Sometimes we shouldn't do it in a condescending way. Sometimes you'll be unpopular and you'll lose an election. So be it. You can go do something a little more productive.
Yeah, that walking away from TPP was a shock, and most people consider it from the Asia perspective, which is absolutely right. But it also touched on Latin America very significantly, and our Canadian partners to the north as well. If there's one thing we could do, from my personal perspective, to restore some semblance of the trade agenda ex ante, is to take another look at that. But your comments about the political reality today are very well made. And I was hoping exactly you would get into that type of political level substance because, in order to promote a certain agenda, you got to have the right political environment. And so I think you laid it out very, very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You've been a terrific, Senator. Thank you for those thoughts. Thank you for your time. As promised, you were just really spectacular. We hope you'll come back at some point in the future.
I'd love it. I'd love when we're back assembled in a physical room as well and break bread together. Thanks, Eric.
You got it. Thank you, Senator.
Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, after a short break, we'll hear from World Bank President David Malpass. A quick reminder, our hashtag is 2022 WCA. If you want to join that Twitter conversation that we were just talking about, that's again, hashtag 2022 WCA. Stay with us.
Con flores de camisa, el baile horizontal, subieron las hormigas, bajaron las cosquillas como se baja el mar.
My fellow gods, the dark skies have spoken.
It is time for Susan and I to retire.
But where will you go?
Zeus! Sorry, Zeus! I need a charge in the... Oh! Thanks!
Sweetheart, it's not rocket